everybody. We're so glad to have you here. We are going to talk about Millennials and Gen Z. We're talking about younger donors today in 2024. And we're going to dive right in. So quick notes here, a little housekeeping. This event is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits if you need those. And so there's a question at the end, and we will use that to certify your participation. So please make a note there, and we'll make that happen. Here's the agenda, just very quickly. The most important thing here is that the recording and the slides will be sent around after the fact. Still, someone's going to ask about that in 15 minutes, so you can do me a favor and respond to them in the chat when they do ask. Happens every time, no matter what, but we have more than 1,000 folks on the call, so it's the law of large numbers. Here we go. All right, so let's dive in. Very quick intros. My name is Patrick. I am extremely lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of an organization called FreeWill, alongside my dear friend, Jennifer Shias-Spradling. Jenny is way out in Seattle. I'm currently talking to you from Manhattan, the island of Manhattan in New York City. Delighted to be here. And we are very fortunate to work alongside a wonderful team at FreeWill of nearly 200 folks. We together have raised $10 billion for nonprofit organizations. We have 1,600 nonprofit partners, including many of you. So if that is you, just from the bottom of our heart, big, big, big thank you. Really big thank you. And together we have more than 4 centuries of fundraising expertise, which is part of the result of the fact that we're all just getting older. But we work really hard on this and try to make it happen. Okay, and then last thing, because my marketing team wants me to tell you that FreeWill is by far the largest plan giving solution in the United States. If you're interested in plan giving, come talk to us. Trusted by folks like the Red Cross and Amnesty International and the United Way, Susan Komen, featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, AARP, all sorts of fun things. It's just a result of us working really hard to help support you all. So if you're ever interested, at the end of the session, we will drop a survey in the chat, and we would love to tell you more about this in a one-on-one context, either about plan giving or how to get things like more DAF gifts, more stock gifts, more donors, whatever you need. So come talk to us. And you know, these webinars are supported by viewers like you. So folks like you who eventually join the FreeWill universe make all this stuff possible for free for everybody else. So thank you for that. And then just one other thank you is we love having you here. It's really important to us to help the whole sector, all of us together, learn about how the world is changing, what to do about it. One of the ways we say thank you, besides putting a ton of work into this, is by giving away books to some folks who come. So we are going to give away one of my favorite books, a book called Generations by Dr. Jean Twenge. Not sure how to say her name, but it really dives into the differences between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silents, et cetera, and how each of these has shaped America and what it might mean for the future as different generations take hold. So if you're interested, the way to do this is at the end of the session, we will drop a survey in the chat. My colleague Phoebe will do it. Big thank you to Phoebe, who's here and put a ton of work into making this happen. And make sure to include your address. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So how's your week going? Answer is not as well as usual. So just to note this here, even though it is summer, we're seeing a little bit of a dip in happiness, a little bit more anxiety, a little bit of loneliness. Some of this might have been with the recent stock market jitters. We can talk about that just very quickly. Stock market was down pretty considerably, about 3% in the S&P 500, one of the largest drops in recent memory in the last 18 months or so. And yet, let's just remember the stock market is up 10% on the year. Things are generally going well. And in fact, it's up today. So general vibes, don't panic here. So generally good news there. Stay calm, don't overread the headlines. And by the way, of course, most of these things go up and to the right over time. Flat from last week in terms of how confident we are about hitting our goals. And hopefully some of what we'll talk about in the next 45 minutes or so will allow us to hit our goals a little bit better. Okay, so let's dive in very quickly in the chat. If you are, actually feel free to just name your generation. So if you are a boomer, a silent generation, and Gen Zer. I assume there are no Gen Alphas on the call. We got some Gen Xers. You are not forgotten Gen Xers. Wow, we're going off. All right, some Zennials. It's really funny. The younger Gen Xers really want to claim Zennials, Boomers, a lot of Millennials, a couple of Gen Zers. All right, so pretty solid mix. I would say that Millennials might be the most represented, but it's pretty close. So welcome to the party, everybody. Let's go first about who Millennials are. So Millennials, yours truly included here. Born between 1981 and 1996. So this year, 2024, we are about 28 to 43. Some of us are getting pretty old. There are 73 million millennials in the United States, largest generation in America right now. Boomers were actually, more boomers were born in the United States than millennials. And yet, obviously, as boomers age, millennials tend to, are now the largest. Over half of all Americans are millennials or younger. Right, those of you that are paying attention to the upcoming election realize that this is becoming quite important. And we'll talk about Gen Z, everybody's favorite youngest generation, born between 1997 to 2012. Today, they are 12 to 27 years old. Just as a note here, we're not going to talk about fundraising from 12-year-olds, right? We can have that as a different topic for a different time. So today we'll focus on adult Gen Z folks when we talk about fundraising. I assume that there aren't a lot of 14-year-olds on the call, so hope you don't feel left out. There are 70 million Gen Zers in the United States. Interesting to note, smaller than millennials, right? Smaller than boomers, smaller than millennials. We'll talk about why that's smaller. And there will be 41 million folks who are in this category and over 18 in 2024. One of the first times that these folks are voting. So this is the first really big Gen Z election. So interesting to see how that works out. You can see here what it looks like in terms of projected population. You can see this doesn't have Gen Z, apologies, but you can see that if you are a fundraiser, and let's say you are under or over 30, over 35, millennials will be the largest generation that you work with for the rest of your career, right? Millennials are just extremely large. And not necessarily aging out at any point the way boomers and silents will. And so understanding millennials is going to be an enormous key to the rest of your career. Now, obviously, over the next few decades, understanding boomers and Gen X plays a big role. Folks in the silent generation, there won't be that many in 5 or 10 years. Kimberly says, my young intern from 2 years ago gave a major gift this summer. Wow. Congratulations to you, Kimberly. That's pretty exciting. And so when we look at overall population in the United States right now, right, you can see Gen Alpha, by the way, is the youngest, right? So, when Gen Z starts getting outclassed and fashioned by Gen Alpha, the rest of us can enjoy that. But Gen Alpha is still being born, right? So that generation is not complete yet. About 39 million, Gen Z a little under 70. You can see millennials are the largest. Gen X, this is worth noting, right? For all you Gen Xers, a lot of Gen X folks say, why don't we get more attention? Objectively, you should. But one of the reasons is that Gen X has historically been a smaller generation and was never larger than boomers and was never larger than millennials except in the very early years of millennials being born. And so you just have this interesting dynamic where you have these larger than smaller than larger generations. Now, this shows the silent generation in terms of how many people are alive today, but actually alive ever is much smaller than boomers. So silent generation, small generation, those kids, Gen X tends to be the kids of the silent generation. Millennials tend to be the kids of the boomer generation. So that's why you have 2 big generations sandwiching 2 small generations. Let's talk about some more shared facts. Gen Z is the most racially and ethnically diverse generation, and millennials are much more so than older generations, right? So you just fundamentally grow up in a different environment. Different views around race and ethnicity by generation are in part the product of growing up in vastly different environments. About 56% of American millennials are non-Hispanic white, compared to 51% of Gen Z. That's actually a typo. Oh, sorry, no, that is correct. I'm sorry. 56% of American millennials are non-Hispanic white, compared to 51% of Gen Z. So Gen Z is one of the first generations that is basically 50-50 white and non-white in the sort of traditional parlance. Obviously, Hispanic white is a thing as well. And Gen Z will dip below 50% non-Hispanic white by 2026 due to ongoing immigration. This is a pretty big shift from what you would have seen in the boomers or silent generation, right? Really, really big shift. And so what does that look like? You can see here over time, and this is a little bit of a difficult graph to decipher, but take a look, right? If you go back to when baby boomers are born, and you look at the number of folks who are born here, right? It's 4.5 million total, so born per year. You can see how actually incredibly white the country is and how small the populations of Hispanics and African Americans and Asians are. And then you drift into the 80s and 90s and you see how big that shift is, right? So folks who were born into the 40s just have a fundamentally different picture of what typical Americans look like compared to someone who was born in 2006. And so you start to see this play out in various ways. Also, fewer people are being born, right? So crude birth rate is not an impolite term. That's how demographers refer to birth rates, crude birth rates, which tends to be birth rates per, I think, 1,000 women per year. And you can see how much they're dropping off from 1800 to 2020. And so subsequent generations, a mix of economic pressures, a mix of access to modern birth control, a mix of different expectations in family, more women in the workplace, all these things play a role here. And you can see, wow, it's a lot of kids being born in the 1820s. I actually don't know you see that huge jump all the way to the left, right? From about 1812 to 1820, suddenly there are a lot more kids being born. I obviously wasn't around then. If anyone has any research on that, we'd love to know. Ending the War of 1812, says Arden. Maybe I could see that, right? If you have basically, we talk about the baby boomers, and baby boomers kick off with the end of World War II. And so it's very possible that you basically have the original baby boomers who are the 1813s, right? The folks who are born as soldiers are coming back from the War of 1812. This is all conjecture. I will get more information for you about the extreme birth rates in 1813 before we come back, but we will not focus on that. Right now, it's just a little interesting fact. Some of you were saying immigration jump. That would result in total births, but not births per women. So that might not be correct. All right, let's talk about our favorite divide, which is older millennials versus younger millennials. And one of the ways to describe older millennials that I adore is this phrase called the Oregon Trail generation. So some of you may have played this, especially in your early years. So why do we call it the Oregon Trail generation? This is 1981 to 1989. Again, sort of proud member of Oregon Trail generation. This was the last micro generation to remember life before the internet, before widespread use of the desktop computer, before cell phones. And so these are folks that sort of came of age with the early internet and with early software, right? So many of you know this, but to recap it, the way that it became the Oregon Trail generation is, for most of us, our public libraries, which were the first places where we interacted with computers, only had like 5 games. It was Oregon. Someone's going to have to help me out here. It was Oregon Trail. It was something called Number Munchers, which was a math game. It was Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? And then there were a couple of others. People are saying Minesweeper. That even felt a little bit later. There was a typing tutor, but there were just a handful of things. And so everyone had this shared experience because there weren't that many games that existed. And by the way, if you ever get a chance, go back and play the original Oregon Trail. It is an absolute delight. And so you basically have this generation that rises with technology, but remembers life before computers and before the internet in a way that even later millennials don't, let alone Gen Z. And then off to college right as 9/11 happened. And so you ended up having a relatively, in the United States, a relatively inward-facing view, right? The 90s were sort of a calm period post-fall of the Berlin Wall, right? So just this sort of peaceful Pax Americana through the 90s, and then boom, 9/11 happens, and suddenly everyone sort of looks back up at the whole world. And so you have a really interesting lens there. They remember the Clinton years, but they were really shaped by the second Bush presidency, meaning Bush the younger, and the Obama years. Younger millennials, right, born between 1990 and 1996, a little bit later, they are now 20 to 34. Even these folks are nearing 30, right? So millennials, we're all getting older. They've been part of the workforce for a decade or longer, and their adolescence shaped less by the rise of technology and more by the Great Recession, the release of the iPhone, the Obama presidency. Um, so those are millennials, right? You've got your older millennials, your younger millennials, and older millennials we'll call the Oregon Trail generation because it's really fun to do so, and it really tells the story of this group coming of age. So now we have older Gen Z, right? Born between 1997 and 2022. 2002. These are the first folks who are born into technology, right? They're the first what we call digital natives, as opposed to digital immigrants, meaning they've always had tech at their fingertips. More than 2/3 use Instagram every single day, right? Every single day. Vocal about issues around social justice, climate change, and equity. They grew up with the 24-hour news cycle, experienced major life events disrupted by COVID, and spent life from a young age on social media, right? So if you were born in 2002, you're about 2 years old when Facebook gets invented. And you're probably on a bunch of these things quite quickly. Okay, so how high a priority are millennial organizations for your, are millennial donors for your organization? You see, a lot of folks put this in the forward category. It is not yet the most important, but it's getting there. And that's roughly where you ought to be, right? You can see this. And then Gen Z, people say, okay, really 3 is the highest. That's actually probably the right place to be, right? It's probably the right place to be that say, look, Gen Z doesn't have a ton of resources. It's not a large enough generation of adults yet. So we should know about them. We should put some light effort in, but we're going to get most of our money this year from baby boomers. When we ask you what percentage of your total gifts come from millennials, it's still quite low, right? Setting aside the folks who aren't sure, only 15% of organizations say they receive more than a quarter to a half, and only 3% receive more than half of their total number of gifts, right, from millennials. And then you look at Gen Z, and the real thing here is that no one's getting more than a quarter of their gifts from Gen Z. That makes a lot of sense. When we look at what percentage of major donors, again, relatively small percentage of major donors across the board. We didn't even ask about Gen Z for major donors because the answer for that would mostly be close to 0. Now, not zero, but close to 0. Now, that is going to change over time, and being ready for that shift is one of the most important things to take away from today. All right, so let's dive in. Millennials, Gen Z, and philanthropy. There's good news coming down the pike, right? Millennials are a philanthropic bunch. 74% of themselves consider themselves a philanthropist, compared to only 35% of boomers. Now, some of that might be more self-confidence, but a lot of it is actually more interest in giving, right? Between 2016 and 2022, millennial households increased annual giving by 40%. It's a pretty big jump. Now, some of this is more net worth, and some of this is more active giving. Over the same time frame, annual giving from Gen X and boomers decreased, right? So when we look at, right, those of you who saw the Giving USA report, okay, overall giving is down, but we can break it into little components here. And what's happening is boomers are giving a little bit less, Gen X is giving a little bit less, millennials are giving more, but not enough to outweigh the decreases between Gen X and boomers. 87% of millennial employees, right, this is a study from Forbes and Fidelity, give to charity, and 70% give more than an hour of time to a charitable cause. 66% track results for nonprofits compared to 32% of boomers. So they're much more tactile, right? This is part of growing up with the internet. We do something, we expect some sort of feedback mechanism. And so when we give money, we want to know, okay, it's being put to use, and where's it being put to use, and a lot more insight and transparency in a way that would have just been more difficult before technology. Millennials and Gen Z are 3 times more likely to advocate for an organization than previous generations, right? So do more advocacy. When we ask folks, how do you communicate with millennials? Obviously, email shows up as the big one, direct mail, but things like text messages, 2%, right? There's a lot of room to grow there. Those of you that are millennials know that you respond to basically every text message, far more than emails. So that's something that we're missing out here. Obviously, some phone calls and video chats as well. What are your organization's main channels for communicating with Gen Z? Again, email, direct mail, social media shows up, good move. Text message is still a little low here, right? So we have to think about this as well. Gen Z is looking to make a real difference, right? So you're seeing this generation come of age, one of the defining characteristics of Gen Z is growing up during COVID, right? Many of them missed a couple of years of college, missed a couple of years of high school potentially in terms of being in person, and really had this sort of shared global experience very early on. 60% decide they want to make a difference in the world. They're most likely to donate because it's the right thing to do. Millennials and Gen Z were the most likely to provide monetary assistance to someone else during the pandemic, right? A really sort of a lot of big grassroots effort making that happen. They prefer to stay in touch with nonprofits more than older generations. They expect more of this give and take. They tend to be less hierarchical, so it's less broadcast and audience. They have this regular interaction expectation. We'll talk more about that in a moment about how they consume media, which is very different than how if you are a boomer or an older Gen Xer, you might consume media. Like millennials, they want to know about an organization's impact before donating, both in terms of facts and in terms of stories, right? So it doesn't just have to be a somewhat dull annual report. Interestingly, they want more communication than other folks say they do, right? So you can see here, what would you welcome monthly communications from? And now let's first look at Gen Z. 74% would welcome email, 80% would welcome text message. Now we're going to contrast this to the only 5% of you that said we're texting Gen Z. So Gen Z says, please text us, and yet that's not happening at all, right? And direct mail, 70%, generally more welcoming to hear from nonprofits than older generations who may be a little bit burnt out with communications at this point, right? So you see millennials close behind, and these numbers tend to trend down as we get older across the board, right? So really, really interesting. Coming back to our friends in the Oregon Trail generation, these are going to be the best younger prospects, right? It just tends to be the case that you accumulate more wealth as you get older. And so as we think about millennials and Gen Z, older millennials are our best bet if we only have so much time to focus on them, right? These will be the older and wealthier. And as a reminder, right, as we're looking for folks who are wealthier, right? Wealthier folks on average can give more. You know, sometimes you get big gifts from folks that are not as wealthy. But on average, we're getting bigger gifts from wealthier folks. There are only 2 ways to become wealthy enough to become a major donor. Does anyone want to give them a quick guess in the chat before we do it? 2 specific ways to become rich, as we say it. All right, everyone's guessing the first one, inheritance. You can also have a job, right? So first 2 things, earning through compensation and or investments. But the second is what we call the old-fashioned way of getting rich, which is I inherited it, right? That's what you would say. And so we're really looking at these 2 things that are happening to millennials at the same time as inheritances are streaming in from older boomer parents, and they're rising in their earning years. So we'll talk about that as well. So trend 1, believe it or not, right? Believe it or not, because this hasn't always been true, and this isn't true for everybody, right? So we're not saying that all millennials are rich. But millennials on the older end of the spectrum are becoming a relatively wealthy bump. Right? Millennials' wealth experienced historic growth during the post-pandemic era. According to a report by Center for American Progress, millennial wealth doubled from 2019 to 2023. So the entire generation's wealth doubled in 4 years, which is astonishing and really worth noting. Why did this happen? A strong labor market, pandemic stimulus, student loan pauses, or in some cases, folks are now old enough to have paid off their student loans, were all contributing factors. But you recall that we've had a relatively tight labor market, which is beneficial to employees. And it's particularly beneficial to employees who can switch jobs to get higher wages and who are more educated, which falls into the category of millennials. But it wasn't limited to high earners. It also impacted lower income millennials. One of the untold economic stories of the last 4 years is that inequality has actually gone down, which is not a thing that makes the news a lot, but historically it has. Gen Z's wealth, right? Again, we're still on the tiny end here, tripled from 2019. And the retail trading boom of the early 2020s, meaning just this sort of big influx of normal people investing smaller amounts of money in the market, significantly helped out millennials and Gen Z. 22% now own individual stocks, up from just 13% only 4 years ago. So you see a huge increase in stock earnings. Ownership of what we call pooled assets, like mutual funds and ETFs, increased from 6% to 9% as well. 6% to 9% is a really big jump, right? It means 50% more folks own these things. So you end up with a lot. Trend two, they are big on investing. So Millennial and Gen Z investors are more likely than others to own stock options from their work. They prefer investing in stock and crypto. They use donor advised funds so they can be more hands-on in the management, right? This sort of growing up digital means there's less stuff that gets shipped off and sort of managed elsewhere. You really want to check every day. Digital tools give next-gen donors a strong sense of control over their investments and their charitable giving. And 40% of millennials and Gen Zers say they check their investments every single day. This is not a healthy thing to do if you are in this category, and yet it's something that happens, right? So don't rise and fall with the daily stock market trends. Just, relax a little bit more. But it is the case that this generation doesn't. Overall, Gen Z is starting to invest and save at 19. They have much more access to investment resources and information than even folks like me did when we were 19, and certainly folks who were baby boomers did when they were 19. It's much younger than when previous generations began investing. Boomers are starting investing at 35, Gen X at 32, millennials at 25, right? So you start to see people saying, okay, well, this is one way to get ahead. 45% of Gen Z, age 21 and older, are investing. So 45% of Gen Z, right? None of these folks are over 30. And 45% are already investing, even at the low levels. Really, really, really interesting. What do they invest in? Well, the most money goes into stocks and 401ks and mutual funds. But the biggest number of people invest in cryptocurrency among this generation. So it's just interesting to note. There are more crypto investors than there are stock investors in this generation. That is a really big deal. Ownership of crypto by age, you actually see 35 to 44. So your Oregon Trail millennials and even your little baby Gen Xers, right? They're the most common owners than 25 to 34. Less so 18 to 24 because there's less money to go around. But you see, this is where it is. Really, really interesting to see. Bonus trend, this is a really important thing, right? So this is the thing that fundraising doesn't talk about enough. And you still send direct mail with direct response cards. And what happens? Nobody has checks anymore. This is one of the most important things to happen in direct mail that nobody talks about. 45% of American adults did not write a single check in 2022, according to Yahoo News. Check usage is a sharp decline for all age groups. 43% of Gen Zers and 50% of millennials have not written a check in the last year. I believe I'm in that category as well. I don't recall writing one. And the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia, our experts in Pennsylvania, have even predicted that paper checks will be obsolete by 2026. This feels a little early to me. I'm not trying to overrule the Fed. We don't do that in this democracy, but they're in a sharp fade. And so this really, really changes the way we think about direct mail in an important way. Trend three, they get FOMO. You can see this. Those of you that are in major cities, you walk around and someone's doing a TikTok dance on a corner. But FOMO, or what millennials call the fear of missing out, FOMO, is the feeling that others are experiencing a more rewarding experience without you. Social media makes this a lot worse. Extremely common among 18 to 33-year-olds. And it can apply to in-person experiences, official events, hanging out with friends, online trends, participating in movements, participating in campaigns, in causes, etc. People want to join in on activities with their peers in person and online, right? They want both. We want to be part of things. There is a core human need to be part of something and not to be lonely or isolated or ostracized. Participating in online trends is a form of community building that these groups are very, very comfortable with, right? Mostly not to do with charitable giving or charitable causes. And why this can be a bad thing, right? Some of you are raising teenagers and struggle when your teenagers struggle with FOMO on something you don't want them to do. It can also be a motivation for good. Millennials will remember Facebook trends like the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge in 2014, which went super viral and raised an enormous amount of money for ALS research. You recall people filmed themselves dumping a bucket of ice on their heads. It was quite cold, and challenged others to do the same. It raised $115 million for ALS. And look, these things are very hard to replicate. It's not magic, but you do want to understand this as well. Trend four, millennials are set to inherit trillions of dollars, right? When we talk about getting rich the old-fashioned way, millennials will be on this curve, not many, or not all, but many in the very near term. Over the next 25 years, around 70 to 90 trillion dollars will be passed on from wealthy baby boomers in the great wealth transfer. Mercifully, a good portion of that is going to go to charity, like yours. So if you are not involved in planned giving, this is exactly the time to do so. But a lot of it's going to go to their kids, as you might imagine. And by 2030, there's an estimate that millennials will have 5 times as much wealth as they have in 2021. So when we were having this conversation in 6 or 7 years, we will be talking about the enormous number of major donors who are millennials, in part dealing with money and assets that they inherited, not that they've earned, or a combination of two. Millennials will be projected to become the wealthiest generation in history. Why is this? Because boomers are the wealthiest generation in history, and that money has to go somewhere. Oh, and by the way, we talked about those birth rates at the beginning, right? We talked about the sort of funneling and fewer kids per family. Boomers had fewer children than their parents did, and so inheritances are more concentrated per child. My mom, who's a baby boomer, was one of 7 kids in the great town of Cumberland, Rhode Island, in the Ocean State. And 7 kids was large, but not incredibly large in her community. Meanwhile, I'm one of 4, and that is a very large family among my friends, with the exception of those who are very religious, typically Mormon or Catholic. And so you end up with these much smaller families, and it means inheritances are much more concentrated than they used to be. I see some good shout outs for Rhode Island. It is honestly a great place. If you haven't been, if you haven't spent some time in the summer, go to Rhode Island, particularly the southern coast, but also the Woonsocket, Cumberland area is lovely. All right, one of the things that's really interesting here as we think about who's set to inherit trillions is that when you think about wealth creation among millennials, it's actually concentrated in a few areas. What are those places? San Francisco, LA, New York City. In fact, about 44% of all millennial millionaires are in just those 2 states, California and New York. You know, next other bastions of millennial millionaires are places like Texas, with a lot of industry, Washington State with a lot of tech, Boston and Massachusetts with a lot of pharmaceutical and technology, some in New Jersey. A lot of that is sort of the overflow of New York industry. And yet, millionaires, as a general rule, non-millennial millionaires, are more spread out. You can see here in the counties around the country. And so you'll end up having more diverse set of millennial wealth from those that receive inheritances, as opposed to where the most money was made in compensation. So it's very interesting to see. Trend 5, they are very online. It cannot be understated how overstated how comfortable this group is online. Millennials spend on average 6 hours a day online. Gen Z spends 7 hours a day online. For Gen Z, their high school or their college years were interrupted by pandemic. So all that extra learning about offline life went into even more learning about online life. They might view certain traditions as less formal because they experience them through Zoom. Many of them are going to their remote jobs in sweatpants that you can't see. They're doing job interviews on Zoom. They're online graduation for some, sadly, new employee onboarding. And so you create this sort of lack of formality, in part because of all of the experiences that shape their lives. When you look at screen time by generation, you can see how vast it is. In fact, Gen X, right, the original latchkey kids that we see you, Gen X, made that first big jump in screen time, far, far over silents and boomers, and then it goes steadily up from millennials and Gen Z, right? Big shift here. The average unlocks per day, how many times do you take your phone and open it per day among smartphone users in the US? This is 2018. It's the last time we saw data for this. 79 times a day for Gen Z, 63 for millennials, 49 for Gen X, a mere 30 times a day, which is still a ton for baby boomers and silent generation, right? Really big shifts here as well. When we think about what is online, what does online mean? It's a lot of social media, Instagram, TikTok, and one of the big divides between older and younger folks is that younger folks realize that YouTube is actually social media, whereas older folks treat it as an extension of television, right? Fundamentally different role. Older generations are going to either watch repurposed professional content. We're going to go watch that Mets game from the 80s that was really good. Or we're going to go try to find a clip from our favorite movie. Or we're going to watch how-to videos, right? How do I put a light bulb into this, small fixture? Whereas younger generations are connection, right? They use things like, some of you know what get ready with me videos are, or morning routines, or what I eat in a day. Get ready videos is sort of taken off among young women, And it's basically a woman sort of doing makeup, hair, et cetera, getting ready for going out, but also talking about her life and sort of really sharing it in a fun way. And these things take off. They have millions and millions of views. In fact, when you look at proportion of video that is professionally produced versus content creator produced, content creator is like what we're doing right now, right? We don't have a professional studio. We're just talking to you directly. Gen Z basically gets about half of their content from, and this includes, by the way, all Netflix watching, all TV, all Olympics, right? All that stuff counts as professionally produced. And yet still half of the content that Gen Z imbibes is this creator, this sort of more authentic, lower budget, more niche, compared to Gen X, who is still viewing mostly professionally produced content. It's a very, very big shift. Trend 6, influence is far-reaching. So young people have always captured the spirit of the times. These are the shapers of taste. They are shapers of fashion. It is even more true in the internet age. Millennials and Gen Z are highly adept at using social media to spread ideas, trends, favorite causes within seconds. If you are wondering why 90s fashion is back, it is because Gen Z is very good at spreading it over social media. Their ability to amplify trends makes them key players in setting cultural and political agenda. And one of the things that was interesting to see here, right, setting aside the politics of it, you can see this in 2024 election, right? There was sort of this real flat energy around the Biden campaign. And then when Kamala Harris announced, you saw all these viral memes. There's a meme around brat, which we won't have to go into, a meme around coconut tree, we also won't go into. And after rebranding Kamala HQ, the campaign's TikTok gained 40% of its total likes in just 3 days as you watch this explode. And you watch people put their own spin on a shared theme. It's a really interesting dynamic, right? You have this sort of, everyone puts their own identity across a shared belonging. And this was just one example of a recent trend, which was super interesting to see. The Harris campaign raised $310 million in July with 2/3 in first-time donors. And a lot of this came from Gen Z and millennials, not the huge number of, huge dollars, right? These $10 million, billionaire contributions are not coming from Gen Zers, but it's a reminder that the support really fueled a lot of the other stuff. And as fundraisers, you really want to take these generations seriously. I appreciate all the brat jokes in the chat. Thank you very much. So let's dive into some strategies here, right? First is we need to get out the welcome mat for these folks. We want to think about how to welcome them into philanthropy. Remember that a lot of these folks are new to giving. Now, they may have just paid off debts. Many of them, this is an important concept here, is that Gen Z and millennials often were not as religious as preceding generations, right? They didn't grow up going to church or synagogue or mosque weekly in a way that other folks did who were born 50 years earlier. And so what happened is, for a lot of people, that weekly house of worship attendance was the first time they gave, and they started giving at 7 or 8 or 12. Excuse me. And so for folks that wasn't the experience, charitable giving might be a little bit newer. They won't be inherently knowledgeable about all the different ways to give. And so it is up to us as a sector to make giving as easy and accessible as possible. For things like giving circles, meaning when you want to establish, okay, above this, you get a certain credit. You're in the chairman's group, you're in the executive director's circle, you're the president's circle, the legacy circle. For those under 40, consider having a lower threshold, right? Maybe to get to get into our medallion level, that's $20,000 a year. But if you're under 40, it's $5,000 a year. Older donors will welcome younger donors into the fold. And for newly acquired younger donors, they'll get in the habit of larger gifts, and they'll be exposed to other people who are making really sizable gifts. So it's a win-win all around. Part of welcoming them also means educating them on impactful ways to give, things like stock, crypto, donor-advised funds, right? Crypto ownership is dominated by this group, and crypto investors don't want to jump through any hoops to give. Plus, with a volatile market, they prefer to give nearly instantaneously as opposed to call you and set up a meeting to talk about it and then give 2 weeks later. If they have to wait 24 to 48 hours to make a gift, they may give elsewhere or their attention may just fall off, right? So you get these folks who are motivated by movements and moments. You want to make sure you are able to take those gifts when they're ready to give. The S&P 500 grew by 90% from 2019 to 2023. Millennials in particular benefited from this and saw a boost in their assets. 55% of millennials own stock, right, compared to other folks. And introducing stock giving as an option for millennial donors will be a huge advantage at end of year. So if you are openly asking for stock gifts, openly asking for crypto gifts on top of donor advised funds, you will really signal to these folks that, oh, there's a lot of ways that we can be giving as well, right? Millennials are the fastest growing portion of DAF account holders. Average compound growth rate for dollars granted from millennials is 29%. And you can see what it looks like for other folks. So DAFs on the rise among millennials. And part of this is that many workplaces are offering DAFs as a perk. So it's easier to open them. They just sort of come with the team and go from there. A millennial with a DAF is a potential lifetime donor because that money is set aside for charitable giving, can never be taken back, even if stuff gets more expensive. So it tends to be a really, really good win. Just an example here, a little case study is our friend Lakshmi, former coworker, really awesome woman, awesome engineer. Went to Harvard. She's a world traveler. She worked at Google. She worked at FreeWill. Sort of epitomizes successful millennial. I think she's a young millennial, I guess medium millennial. She owns a bunch of Google stock. And when we ask her about, how's that Google stock feel? It feels different. It feels like bonus money. She invested in crypto early. She saw huge gains. She preferred to give stock. Her big causes are animal rights and disaster relief, but no one ever asked her about it. And it's not obvious on the website. And so she ends up giving $50 or $80. And someone says, wow, great, we got another young donor for $80. But you actually might have missed out on a $10,000 gift here. And you just don't know it because we didn't ask in the right way. As we think about this, right, what is the right way? We want a link on your standard donate page, not just the ways to give page. When you ask people to donate, make sure you're linking to crypto, stock, and DApps. You can add a checkbox in surveys or other things to gauge interest. In every survey, you want to ask, would you like to know more about this? And in major donor conversations, you might say, many of our supporters give stock. Would you like information of how other people are doing this? It helps them save a lot of money in their taxes and have a bigger impact for less cost. And you're putting yourselves on the side of the donor on their behalf because what they want to do is have more impact at less cost, right? That's fundamentally what they're looking for across the board. Strategy 3, we want to meet them where they are, right? They're spending hours a day on their phone. They're texting, and apps are how they're most comfortable communicating. Treat communication and recognition for these groups differently. You can get more personal texts, individual emails, social media, DMs. In fact, texts have nearly 100% open rate among these groups. In fact, 19% say they never check voicemails, which I don't understand, and yet it still happens. Just as a note here, someone often at this point asks, well, aren't text messages too informal, too personal? And then you ask, well, who would rather get a text message than a phone call? And every single person raises their hand. People don't want phone calls. They do want text messages. And you can always say, hey, you can text, say, is there a good time to call you? I'd love to tell you a little bit more about what's happening here. And so you can always set up a phone call, but especially if they don't have your number. I mean, most of you are getting a lot of spam calls a day to your cell phone and just not picking up. So all that. Average time spent per day by users on platforms. Again, TikTok and YouTube off the charts here. Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram. Interesting here, right? So you see a big rise in YouTube in particular. And what that means is the sort of short form, authentic video. This is a really interesting thing to try that is cheap and affordable, and not enough people do it. Younger donors see non-professional, authentic video as a common and compelling form of communication and connection. What does that mean? It says, hey, I'm here at the animal shelter. We just picked up 2 new dogs that we're fostering. Here, take a look at them, say hi, Fido or whatever. Like, well, we're trying to raise a couple $100 to get them a new home. Do you want to chip in? It doesn't have to be doesn't have to be excellent, doesn't have to be amazing. If you take a quick video of your work, and you speak directly to camera, it can be on the phone, it can be on a little phone tripod as you have here. Just try it, right? It's not that hard, it's not that scary, and you can get this done. Strategy 5, we want positive social proof, not negative social proof. Young donors want to join in, they want to be part of activities with peers. It means that once you've acquired a younger donor, you have the best chance of attracting additional support from this cohort. Social proof and other donor testimonials featuring other young supporters can be a powerful motivator to give, and either go big and feature a donor testimonial in your next outreach, or make small adjustments to your messaging that talks about how other people give, right? Many of our donors do this. Many folks do this, be one of the crew, etc. Edelyn says, for an end of year appeal, I did a video thank you and got the best engagement with my portfolio, right? So thank you for the proof, Edelyn. Really appreciate it there. And bonus strategy here is that this group has a high, what we call BS meter, which we won't spell out, but authenticity will go very far with this group. We don't think you should prioritize going viral or the memification of your nonprofit. We do think you should be open to looking beyond tried and true practices for older donors to meet these new folks where they are. They can tell when they're being pandered to, and they appreciate authenticity. So don't overlook them as potential major donor prospects, and also don't overthink how to connect with them. Just be yourselves, do your great work, and share it, and we will go from there. All right, so that concludes all the things we're going to tell you about Gen Z and millennials. We had fun. We hope you had fun too. My colleague, Phoebe, thank you, Phoebe, is just dropped a, in the chat, if you go to the chat right now, there's a link at the bottom, and it's a 30-second survey, but one of the first things in the survey will be, do you want a copy of this book? And if so, what is your address? Make a note in the survey if you'd like a chance to get a copy, tell us where to send it. So do that, please. And then please, 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 we don't normally sort of say, definitely come on Thursday. Definitely come on Thursday. So at noon Eastern on August 8th, there's just a question here. Anthony says, how is National Make a Will Month going? National Make a Will Month, which is August, is off to an incredible start. And a similar thing is what we call NEPA, National Estate Planning Awareness Week. It happens in October. So we would love to share more about this. It is one of the most powerful ways to do plan gifts without that much work, to be honest, because you have this sort of concentrated effort. So we're going to hear from the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption. Those of you know Dave Thomas from Wendy's fame. We're going to hear from my friend Sue at the American Diabetes Association. She is outstanding. And we're going to hear from Kiernan, who is the Director of Development Plan Giving at the University of St. Thomas. And so all these folks will talk about their own experience. How do you raise plan giving among, as you can tell, a pretty big variety of organizations? And so Jillian says, is there a link to register? Jillian, if you note in the chat that you want to come, we will send you a calendar invite today. So please click on that link and invite yourself to this. We would love to have you there. Feel free to come. It's probably going to be about 45 minutes. Bring lunch, bring coffee, hang out, get your stretches in, whatever you need to do to learn about this. But it's going to be really, really interesting to hear from these folks. Really smart folks, especially, well, I don't want to say especially anyone, but some of the leading thinkers in plan giving that will get you a little bit smart and good to know what these folks are doing. Okay, so next steps. We only have about 2 minutes for questions. Please fill out the survey. Our next webinar is on the 27th. And right now, we are finalizing our 2024 Plan Giving Report, which is sort of the premier report on how plan giving is going in America. And so we will be unveiling the big learnings from that in, I guess this is 3 weeks. So on August 27th. So we're giving you a little bit of an August break. I will miss you a lot. But in 3 weeks, we will do this. If, of course, you would like more content, you can just come on Thursday. If you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, or you want to hear more about FreeWill, you can make it a note in the survey, or you can shoot me an email at patrick@freewill.com. We would love to share that. And with that, we only have about 1 minute. So maybe we'll just pause on questions, and we will look at your questions, and we'll come back and make sure they get answered in a future webinar. But instead, I just want to use the last moment to say a really big thank you for a couple of things. One is all of you who are participating right now in Make a Will Month. It is an enormous team effort, much like these ice bucket challenges or other things where you get a lot of people doing it at the same time. It creates enormous momentum for all organizations. If you're not doing it, make sure you're part of it next year. But we're already seeing tons and tons of giving come in. We expect to be over $400 million in giving this Make a Will Month, which is very, very exciting. So a big shout out to you. Thank you for coming to this session and getting a little bit smarter on some of the generations that are going to define philanthropy for the next 50 years. Pretty exciting. Some of you are asking for copies of the slides and recording. I'm not sure if you're just trolling me, but in any case, We will send them around to you later today. Please do not worry. We will send you the recording and the slides and a link to the survey if you haven't filled it out already, and a link to Thursday's event if you haven't joined already. But we will see you very soon. Have a wonderful rest of the summer.